The bitter wind howled across the frozen training compound in Anchorage, Alaska, as Captain Elena Vasquez stood among 37 other candidates, her weathered hands steady despite the -20-degree temperature. At 52, she was easily the oldest person in the line, her salt and pepper hair tucked beneath a regulation beanie, while men and women half her age shifted nervously around her. The Special Operations Command Arctic Warfare Division had opened applications for the first time in 5 years, and Elena had been the last person anyone expected to see at the selection trials. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Colonel Matthews, a granite-faced man with Arctic warfare ribbons covering his chest, paced before the assembled candidates like a predator sizing up prey. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he barked out names from his tablet, each one echoing across the compound with military precision. When he reached her name, his voice carried a distinct note of skepticism that everyone present could hear. Vasquez Elena, age 52. He paused, looking up from his screen with barely concealed disdain. Captain, are you certain you're in the right place? The senior officer's retreat is next month. Laughter rippled through the group of candidates, most of whom looked like they belonged on magazine covers rather than in sub-zero combat conditions. Elena stood straighter, her dark eyes meeting the colonel's gaze without flinching. She had expected this moment, prepared for it, but the sting of public humiliation still cut deep. "Sir, I'm exactly where I need to be," she replied, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from decades of military service. Colonel Matthews shook his head with theatrical dismay. "Ma'am, with all due respect, Arctic Special Operations isn't a retirement hobby. We need operators who can survive in conditions that would kill most people, not someone who should be planning their pension." The assembled candidates exchanged glances, some looking uncomfortable while others openly smirked. Elena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she remained silent. What none of them knew was that the woman they were dismissing had already survived conditions that would have broken most of them years ago. Elena Vasquez had been born in Fairbanks, Alaska, to a family that understood winter in ways most people never would. Her father, a bush pilot, had taught her to read weather patterns before she could properly read books. Her mother, a nurse at the regional hospital, had shown her how to treat frostbite and hypothermia with whatever supplies were available. Growing up in a place where temperatures regularly dropped to 40 below zero had given Elena an intimate relationship with cold that most people would never comprehend. At 18, she had enlisted in the Army, drawn by the promise of adventure and the chance to serve something larger than herself. What her recruitment papers had listed as her military occupational specialty was 9-2A, Automated Logistical Specialist. For 34 years, that had been her official designation in every document, every performance review, every promotion ceremony. The paperwork painted the picture of a competent but unremarkable supply officer who had worked her way up through the ranks via steady, unspectacular service. The reality was far more complex. Elena's logistical background had been her cover for assignments that required someone who could operate in extreme environments while maintaining perfect operational security. She had spent months at a time in places that didn't appear on any maps, coordinating supply drops and extraction missions in conditions that would have killed most soldiers within hours. Her specialty hadn't been moving boxes and counting inventory. It had been keeping special operations teams alive in the most hostile environments on Earth. The small apartment she maintained in Anchorage reflected her understated lifestyle. The furniture was functional rather than stylish, chosen for durability rather than appearance. The only decorative elements were a few photographs scattered throughout the space, mostly landscape shots of Alaska's wilderness that she had taken during her rare periods of leave. What visitors never saw was the basement room she had converted into a training area, complete with cold weather gear that would have impressed professional mountaineers and survival equipment that most outdoor enthusiasts had never heard of. Elena's daily routine hadn't changed much since her retirement 6 months earlier. She woke at 4:30 each morning, regardless of the season or weather conditions. Her workout began with a 3-mile run through Anchorage's streets, followed by an hour of strength training that focused on functional fitness rather than aesthetics. At 52, she was in better physical condition than most people half her age, though she never spoke about it or made it obvious to casual observers. Her neighbors knew her as the quiet woman who shoveled their driveways without being asked, and helped elderly residents with their groceries during harsh weather. They had no idea that she regularly spent weekends alone in the Alaskan wilderness, testing her survival skills against conditions that would have challenged experienced outdoorsmen. She told anyone who asked that she enjoyed hiking, a massive understatement that protected both her privacy and her security clearance. The decision to apply for Arctic Special Operations had not been made lightly. Elena had been enjoying her retirement, working part-time as a consultant for outdoor gear companies, and spending her free time exploring the wilderness she had always loved. But 3 months ago, everything had changed when she received a phone call that brought her past rushing back into her present. The call had come from Major Sarah Chun, a former colleague who now worked in Army personnel management. Sarah's voice had carried a weight that Elena immediately recognized as serious business, not a social call between old friends. The conversation had been brief but devastating in its implications. "Elena, I need to tell you something, and it's not going to be easy to hear," Sarah had said without preamble. "Do you remember Operation Frozen Shield from 2019? Elena had remembered it perfectly. Operation Frozen Shield had been a classified mission to establish a forward operating base in the Arctic, designed to monitor potential threats from hostile nations. She had been responsible for coordinating the logistics of the base, ensuring that a team of 12 special operations soldiers could survive for 3 months in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. The mission was compromised, Sarah continued. "We lost contact with the base after 2 weeks, and the rescue team found evidence that the soldiers had died from exposure and equipment failure. The official report blamed extreme weather conditions, but the real problem was logistical breakdown. The supplies weren't adequate for the conditions they faced." Elena had felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had reviewed every supply manifest, double-checked every piece of equipment, verified every calorie count and cold weather rating. The failure of Operation Frozen Shield had haunted her for years, even though the official investigation had cleared her of any wrongdoing. "There's going to be another mission," Sarah had explained. "Arctic Special Operations Command is forming a new unit, and they're looking for the most experienced cold weather operators they can find. The problem is that most of the people with the right experience are either retired or dead. They need someone who understands both the logistics and the survival aspects of Arctic operations." Elena had understood immediately what Sarah was suggesting. At 52, she was theoretically too old for special operations assignments. Military regulations typically limited combat roles to soldiers under 45, with rare exceptions for highly specialized positions. But Arctic warfare was different. It required not just physical ability but wisdom, experience, and the kind of judgment that only came from years of exposure to extreme conditions. "Are you saying they want me to come back?" Elena had asked. "I'm saying they need you to come back," Sarah had replied. "But it won't be easy. You'll have to go through the same selection process as everyone else, and there are people who won't want to see a 52-year-old woman succeed. They'll use your age against you, question your capabilities, and probably make your life difficult just because they can." Elena had spent 3 days thinking about Sarah's offer. Returning to active duty would mean giving up the peaceful retirement she had earned after 3 decades of service. It would mean subjecting herself to the physical and mental challenges of special operations training at an age when most people were considering their legacy rather than their next mission. But it would also mean the chance to prevent another Operation Frozen Shield. The soldiers who had died in that Arctic base had been someone's sons and daughters, husbands and wives, fathers and mothers. Their deaths had been preventable, the result of institutional failures rather than individual heroism or cowardice. If Elena could use her experience to save even one life, the personal cost would be worth it. Her decision had been made on a Tuesday morning while she was running through the pre-dawn darkness of an Alaskan winter. The temperature had been minus 35 degrees, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, but Elena had felt perfectly comfortable in her cold weather gear. She had spent her entire life preparing for challenges that would defeat most people, and she was not about to let age prevent her from serving when her country needed her most. The application process for Arctic Special Operations had been deliberately intimidating. The forms required detailed medical examinations, psychological evaluations, and fitness assessments that would have challenged soldiers half Elena's age. She had passed every requirement, though not without raising eyebrows among the administrative staff who processed her paperwork. Dr. Harrison, the military physician who conducted her medical evaluation, had been particularly skeptical. He was a man in his 40s who specialized in assessing the physical capabilities of special operations candidates, and he had never examined someone of Elena's age for such a demanding assignment. "Ma'am, I have to ask why you're pursuing this at your stage of life," he had said while reviewing her test results. "Your physical condition is remarkable for someone your age, but special operations places demands on the human body that most people can't handle even in their 20s. Elena had met his gaze steadily. "Doctor, I've been handling those demands for longer than most of your candidates have been alive. Age brings experience, and experience prevents mistakes." Dr. Harrison had been forced to approve her application, though his report had included several cautionary notes about the risks of deploying older soldiers in extreme conditions. Elena had read the report during her administrative processing and had found it amusing rather than insulting. The doctor had been trying to protect her from challenges she had already mastered decades ago. The psychological evaluation had been more challenging, not because Elena lacked mental toughness, but because the evaluator had been more interested in her motivations than her capabilities. Dr. Martinez, a military psychologist with experience in special operations, had spent 2 hours probing Elena's reasons for seeking such a demanding assignment at her age. "Captain Vasquez, most people your age are looking forward to retirement benefits and grandchildren," Dr. Martinez had observed. "What drives someone to voluntarily subject themselves to the most challenging military training available?" Elena had considered her answer carefully. The truth was too classified to share, and the simplified version might sound like empty heroics to someone who had never experienced the weight of responsibility that came with special operations assignments. "Doctor, I've spent my entire career preparing for missions that most people can't imagine," she had finally replied. "I'm not ready to stop serving just because a calendar says I'm getting older." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "There are skills I've developed that could save lives, and I believe I have an obligation to use them." Dr. Martinez had made extensive notes during their session, and his final report had been more positive than Elena had expected. He had concluded that she possessed the mental resilience and emotional stability necessary for special operations, though he had also noted that her motivation appeared to be driven by a sense of unfinished business rather than personal ambition. The fitness assessment had been Elena's opportunity to demonstrate that age was not necessarily a limitation. The test had been designed to evaluate cardiovascular endurance, strength, agility, and mental toughness under stress. Elena had approached each challenge with the methodical precision that had characterized her entire military career. The cardiovascular portion had required candidates to complete a series of runs, swims, and obstacle courses within specific time limits. Elena had finished each event well within the required parameters, though she had been careful not to dramatically exceed the standards. Drawing too much attention to her capabilities would have raised questions she wasn't prepared to answer. The strength assessment had been more challenging, not because Elena lacked the necessary physical power, but because the evaluators had seemed surprised by her performance. She had completed every required exercise, from pull-ups to weighted carries, with a competence that contradicted their assumptions about her age and gender. Sergeant Williams, the non-commissioned officer who supervised the fitness testing, had been particularly skeptical. He was a career soldier in his 30s who had worked with special operations candidates for years, and he had never tested someone of Elena's demographic profile. "Ma'am, I have to admit, your performance is impressive," he had said after she completed the final event. But fitness testing and real-world operations are two different things. In the field, there's no second chance if you can't keep up with younger operators. Elena had simply nodded, understanding that his skepticism was based on legitimate concerns rather than personal bias. "Sergeant, I appreciate your honesty. I hope I'll have the opportunity to demonstrate that experience can compensate for youth in ways that matter." The administrative processing had taken 6 weeks, during which Elena had maintained her training routine while waiting for official confirmation of her acceptance into the selection program. She had used the time to research the other candidates, studying their backgrounds and trying to understand what she would be facing during the actual training. The roster of candidates had been impressive and intimidating in equal measure. Most were in their 20s or early 30s, with backgrounds in airborne infantry, special forces, or marine reconnaissance. They were the kind of soldiers who had been training for assignments like Arctic Special Operations since the beginning of their careers. Elena had been the oldest candidate by more than 15 years, and the only woman over 40. The age gap had been significant enough to raise questions about her ability to integrate with a unit composed primarily of soldiers young enough to be her children. But Elena had faced similar challenges throughout her career, and she had learned that competence was ultimately more important than demographics. The week before reporting to the selection trials, Elena had driven to the small cemetery outside Fairbanks where her parents were buried. She had spent an hour sitting by their graves, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point and the challenges that lay ahead. Her father would have understood her decision to pursue such a demanding assignment, even at her age. Her mother would have worried about the risks but ultimately supported her choice. The conversation with her sister had been more difficult. Maria lived in Seattle with her husband and 2 teenage children, and she had been looking forward to Elena's retirement as an opportunity for the family to spend more time together. The news that Elena was returning to active duty had not been well received. "Elena, you're 52 years old," Maria had said during their phone conversation. "You've already given 34 years to the military. Don't you think it's time to consider what you want for yourself?" Elena had struggled to explain her decision without revealing the classified details that had motivated it. "Maria, there are things I can do that other people can't. If I don't use those abilities when they're needed, people might die. I can't live with that responsibility." Maria had been quiet for a long moment before responding. "I understand that you feel obligated to serve, but what happens if you get hurt? What happens if you don't come back? Have you thought about what that would do to the people who love you?" Elena had thought about it extensively. The risks of special operations were real and significant, regardless of age or experience. But the risks of not serving, of allowing other soldiers to face dangers she was uniquely qualified to handle, seemed even greater. "I've thought about it," Elena had admitted. But I've also thought about the soldiers who are going to be placed in situations where my experience could save their lives. I can't choose my own comfort over their safety." Maria had eventually accepted Elena's decision, though not without expressing her concerns about the physical and emotional demands of returning to active duty. The conversation had ended with promises to stay in touch and Maria's reluctant agreement to support Elena's choice. The final preparation had been both physical and mental. Elena had spent the last month before selection intensifying her training, focusing on the specific skills she knew would be tested during the Arctic warfare trials. She had also spent time mentally preparing for the discrimination and skepticism she knew she would face from younger candidates and instructors who saw her age as a disqualifying factor. The morning of her departure for the selection trials, Elena had stood in her apartment, looking at the few personal items she had chosen to take with her. The most important was a small silver compass that had belonged to her father, a practical tool that also served as a reminder of the values that had guided her throughout her life. The compass was simple and functional, qualities that Elena believed were more important than complexity or innovation. Her reflection in the hallway mirror had shown a woman who looked older than the 22-year-old soldier who had first enlisted decades ago, but whose eyes held the same determination and sense of purpose. Elena had spent her entire adult life preparing for challenges that would test her limits, and she was not about to let age prevent her from facing the greatest challenge of her career. The flight to Anchorage had been uneventful, though Elena had noticed the curious glances from other passengers who seemed puzzled by a woman of her age, traveling with military gear. She had used the time to review the selection program materials one final time, studying the requirements and expectations that would govern the next phase of her life. The bus ride from the airport to the training facility had been her first opportunity to observe the other candidates. Most had been quiet, focused on their own preparations and concerns. Elena had recognized the mixture of confidence and anxiety that characterized soldiers preparing for a significant challenge. She had felt the same emotions countless times throughout her career, though experience had taught her to manage them more effectively than her younger counterparts. The barracks assignment had been another reminder of her unique position among the candidates. Elena had been given a single room, officially because of her rank, but she suspected that the administrative staff had been uncertain about how to handle a woman of her age in the typically communal environment of military training. She had not objected to the arrangement, recognizing that privacy might be valuable during the challenging weeks ahead. Her first interaction with the other candidates had been during the evening meal on the day before training began. Elena had chosen a table in the corner of the dining facility, hoping to observe the group dynamics without drawing attention to herself. The strategy had been only partially successful. Lieutenant Morrison, a Ranger-qualified infantry officer, in his late 20s, had approached her table with the kind of confident swagger that Elena recognized as covering underlying insecurity. He had been accompanied by two other candidates, both of whom looked like they belonged in a military recruiting advertisement. "Ma'am, I don't think we've been introduced," Morrison had said, his tone carrying just enough sarcasm to be disrespectful without being overtly insubordinate. "I'm Lieutenant Morrison, and these are Sergeants Jackson and Peters. We were wondering if you might be in the wrong place." Elena had looked up from her meal, studying the three men with the calm assessment she had learned to use when dealing with challenging personalities. "I'm Captain Vasquez, and I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, Lieutenant." Morrison had exchanged glances with his companions, clearly not satisfied with her response. "Ma'am, no disrespect intended, but Arctic Special Operations isn't exactly a typical assignment for someone of your experience level. Are you sure you're not looking for the senior staff orientation?" Elena had set down her fork and met Morrison's gaze directly. "Lieutenant, I've been conducting operations in Arctic conditions since before you were born. I suggest you focus on your own preparation rather than questioning mine." The exchange had been brief, but had established the tone for Elena's relationship with many of the younger candidates. They saw her age as a weakness, a sign that she didn't belong in their elite community. Elena understood their perspective, even if she disagreed with it. She had been young once, convinced that physical capability was the only measure of a soldier's worth. The reality was more complex. Elena's age brought limitations that she couldn't ignore, but it also brought advantages that younger soldiers often overlooked. She had decades of experience in reading situations, making decisions under pressure, and adapting to unexpected challenges. Most importantly, she had survived long enough to accumulate wisdom that could only come from years of facing life-and-death situations. The night before training began, Elena had stood at the window of her barracks room, looking out at the Arctic landscape that would be her testing ground for the next several weeks. The temperature was minus 28 degrees, with wind gusts that would have made the effective temperature even lower. Most people would have seen the landscape as hostile and forbidding, but Elena had seen it as familiar terrain that held no secrets from her. She had spent her entire life preparing for this moment, though she had never imagined that the opportunity would come at the age of 52. The challenge ahead would test not just her physical capabilities, but her mental toughness, her ability to lead and be led, and her willingness to push beyond the limits that others assumed defined her. Elena had gone to bed early, following the routine that had served her well throughout her military career. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of a process that would either vindicate her decision to return to active duty or confirm the doubts that others had expressed about her capabilities. Either way, she would face it with the same determination that had carried her through 3 decades of military service. The alarm had sounded at 4:30, though Elena had been awake for several minutes already. Her internal clock had been conditioned by decades of early mornings and uncertain schedules, and she rarely needed mechanical assistance to wake up. She had dressed quickly in the cold weather gear that would be her uniform for the foreseeable future, checking each piece of equipment with the methodical precision that had become second nature. The walk to the assembly area had been her first test of the day. The temperature had dropped overnight to minus 35 degrees, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes and challenge even the most sophisticated cold weather gear. Elena had felt perfectly comfortable, her body adapted to conditions that would have incapacitated most people. The other candidates had been less prepared for the extreme cold. Elena had noticed several of them struggling with equipment that they had not properly adjusted for the conditions, and she had seen the telltale signs of soldiers who were fighting their environment rather than adapting to it. She had considered offering assistance, but had decided that doing so would only reinforce their perception of her as a motherly figure rather than a peer. Colonel Matthews had arrived precisely on time, accompanied by a cadre of instructors who looked like they had been selected for their ability to intimidate as much as their expertise. Elena had recognized the type immediately: career soldiers who had found their calling in breaking down candidates who thought they were ready for elite units. The colonel's opening remarks had been predictably harsh, designed to establish the tone for the training program and identify candidates who might be easily discouraged. Elena had listened without reaction, having heard similar speeches countless times throughout her career. She had understood that the real test was not in the colonel's words but in how the candidates responded to them. When Colonel Matthews had called her name and made his comment about her age, Elena had felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with being publicly challenged. She had faced similar moments throughout her career, situations where her competence had been questioned based on assumptions rather than evidence. The key was to respond with confidence without appearing defensive or confrontational. Her response had been carefully calculated to establish her position without escalating the conflict. Elena had learned long ago that proving her worth required actions rather than words, and she had been prepared to let her performance speak for itself. The colonel's skepticism was not personal, It was institutional and changing institutional. Attitudes required sustained excellence rather than momentary defiance. The laughter from the other candidates had been expected but still painful. Elena had understood that they were responding to the social cues provided by their instructor, rather than making independent judgments about her capabilities. Most of them had probably never worked with someone of her age in a demanding military environment, and they were relying on stereotypes rather than experience. Elena had remained silent during the colonel's comments, understanding that anything she said would be used to reinforce the perception that she was different from the other candidates. She had learned throughout her career that the most effective response to discrimination was competence, and she had been prepared to demonstrate that age was not necessarily a limitation. The morning briefing had continued with an overview of the training program, a detailed description of the physical and mental challenges that would determine which candidates earned a place in Arctic Special Operations. Elena had listened carefully to every word, mentally cataloging the requirements and comparing them to her own capabilities. The physical standards had been demanding but not impossible. Elena had been training for months to meet the specific requirements of Arctic warfare, and she had been confident in her ability to perform at the necessary level. The mental challenges had been more difficult to prepare for, as they would depend on her ability to adapt to unexpected situations and work effectively with candidates who had already demonstrated their skepticism about her presence. The most challenging aspect of the briefing had been the emphasis on teamwork and unit cohesion. Elena had understood that her success would depend not just on her individual performance, but on her ability to integrate with a group of soldiers who had been conditioned to see her as an outsider. She had faced similar challenges throughout her career, but never in such a high-stakes environment. The briefing had concluded with the announcement of the first training exercise, a 20-mile march across Arctic terrain that would test both physical endurance and cold weather survival skills. Elena had felt a surge of anticipation, recognizing that this would be her first opportunity to demonstrate that her age was not a limiting factor. The preparation for the march had been revealing. Elena had watched the other candidates organize their gear, noting the mixture of confidence and anxiety that characterized soldiers facing their first major test. She had recognized several who were overpacking, bringing too much equipment in an effort to prepare for every possible contingency. Others had been under-prepared, relying on minimal gear that might prove insufficient in extreme conditions. Elena had struck a balance between these extremes, bringing exactly what she needed and nothing more. Her gear selection had been based on decades of experience in similar conditions, and she had been confident that she could complete the march regardless of weather conditions or terrain challenges. The start of the march had been Elena's first opportunity to observe the group dynamics among the candidates. Most had immediately established a pace that was too fast for sustainable movement across difficult terrain, driven by competitiveness rather than tactical thinking. Elena had maintained her own pace, understanding that endurance was more important than speed in Arctic conditions. The first casualty had occurred within the first 5 miles when one of the younger candidates had developed severe blisters due to improperly fitted boots. Elena had watched the instructors evaluate the situation, noting their lack of sympathy for what they considered a preventable injury. The candidate had been withdrawn from the exercise, his selection terminated due to inadequate preparation. Elena had continued moving steadily, her pace consistent despite the challenging terrain and deteriorating weather conditions. She had noticed several of the other candidates beginning to struggle, their initial enthusiasm replaced by the grinding reality of sustained physical exertion in extreme conditions. She had been tempted to offer assistance, but had recognized that doing so would reinforce their perception of her as different from them. The halfway point of the march had been marked by a rest stop that had revealed the true extent of the challenge. Several candidates had been showing signs of exhaustion, their movements becoming less coordinated and their decision-making impaired by fatigue. Elena had used the break to assess her own condition, noting that she felt strong and capable of continuing indefinitely. The second half of the march had been more challenging, as the weather conditions had deteriorated and the terrain had become more difficult. Elena had maintained her steady pace, drawing on decades of experience in similar conditions. She had passed several candidates who had been struggling, offering quiet words of encouragement without making it obvious to the instructors. The finish of the march had been Elena's first victory, though she had been careful not to celebrate or draw attention to her performance. She had completed the exercise within the required time, feeling strong and capable of continuing if necessary. Several of the younger candidates had finished behind her, their faces showing the strain of pushing beyond their comfort zones. Colonel Matthews had been waiting at the finish line, his expression unreadable as he observed the candidates completing the march. When Elena had approached, he had checked her time and nodded curtly, offering no praise or criticism. She had understood that his silence was probably the best response she could have hoped for at this point in the training. The debrief after the march had been Elena's first opportunity to hear the instructor's assessment of the candidate's performance. They had been predictably harsh, focusing on the failures and weaknesses they had observed rather than celebrating the successes. Elena had listened carefully, understanding that their criticism contained valuable lessons for the challenges ahead. The comments about her performance had been minimal but grudgingly positive. Sergeant Williams had noted that she had maintained a consistent pace and had shown good judgment in her gear selection. The praise had been faint, but Elena had recognized it as more than she had expected at this stage of the training. The reaction of the other candidates had been mixed. Some had seemed surprised by her performance, while others had dismissed it as the result of luck or favorable conditions. Elena had understood that changing their perceptions would require sustained excellence rather than a single successful exercise. The evening meal had been more subdued than the previous night, with candidates focused on recovery rather than socializing. Elena had again chosen a corner table, using the time to observe the group dynamics and assess which candidates were adapting well to the training environment. She had noticed several who were already showing signs of stress, their confidence shaken by the reality of the program's demands. Lieutenant Morrison had approached her table again, but his attitude had been slightly different from the previous evening. He had still been skeptical of her presence, but her performance during the march had forced him to reconsider his assumptions. "Ma'am, I have to admit, you did well today," he had said, his tone more respectful than before. "I'm still not sure this is the right place for someone your age, but you've earned some respect." Elena had appreciated his honesty, even if she had disagreed with his underlying assumptions. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I hope I'll continue to earn your respect through my performance rather than my age." Morrison had nodded, seeming to understand that Elena was not looking for special treatment or consideration. "Fair enough, ma'am. I guess we'll see what happens when the training gets really difficult." Elena had smiled slightly, knowing that Morrison had no idea what she had already endured throughout her career. The training ahead would be challenging, but she had faced far worse conditions with far less support. The real test would not be her ability to survive the Arctic, but her ability to prove that age was not a disqualifying factor for someone with her experience and determination. The rest of the evening had been spent in quiet preparation for the next day's training. Elena had reviewed the briefing materials, maintained her equipment, and performed the physical therapy routine that kept her body functioning at peak efficiency. She had been confident in her preparation, but realistic about the challenges ahead. The first day of training had been just the beginning of a process that would test every aspect of her capabilities. Elena had understood that the instructors would be looking for any sign of weakness or limitation that they could use to justify their skepticism about her age. She had been prepared to prove them wrong, not through dramatic gestures, but through sustained competence in every aspect of the training. As she had prepared for bed, Elena had reflected on the day's events and the challenges that lay ahead. She had successfully completed the first test, but the real evaluation would come in the weeks ahead as the training intensified and the margin for error decreased. She had been confident in her abilities but realistic about the obstacles she would face. The ultimate test would come when the training moved from exercises to real-world conditions, when the candidates would be placed in situations where their lives would depend on their ability to perform under extreme stress. Elena had been looking forward to that moment, knowing that it would be her opportunity to demonstrate that experience and wisdom were just as valuable as youth and physical strength. The road ahead would be difficult, but Elena had been prepared for difficulty her entire life. She had faced challenges that would have broken most people, and she had emerged stronger and more capable. The Arctic Special Operations training would be no different, just another test of her ability to excel when others expected her to fail. Elena had closed her eyes that night, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. To prove that age was not a limitation for someone with her experience and determination. She had been ready for whatever the training program could throw at her, confident that her decades of preparation would be sufficient to overcome any obstacle they placed in her path. The second week of training brought a sharp escalation in both difficulty and hostility. Elena discovered that her competent performance during the opening march had not earned her acceptance, but rather intensified the determination of instructors and candidates alike to prove she didn't belong. What had begun as casual skepticism evolved into systematic efforts to expose what they believed were inevitable limitations. Chief Instructor Blackwood, a former Navy SEAL with 23 years of Arctic operations experience, had replaced Colonel Matthews as the primary evaluator. Where Matthews had been dismissive, Blackwood was calculating. He studied Elena with the cold precision of someone analyzing a tactical problem, looking for vulnerabilities he could exploit to achieve his desired outcome. During the morning briefing, Blackwood announced a series of new evaluation criteria that hadn't appeared in any of the original training documentation. The candidates would now be assessed on their ability to carry additional equipment loads. Their performance would be measured against adjusted time standards, and their leadership capabilities would be tested through rotating command responsibilities. Effective immediately, all candidates will carry a minimum of 90 pounds of gear during field exercises, Blackwood announced, his gaze settling on Elena with obvious intent. Arctic operations require personnel who can transport heavy equipment across difficult terrain without compromising mission effectiveness. Elena understood immediately that the weight requirement had been designed specifically to challenge her. At 135 pounds, she would be carrying nearly 70% of her body weight, a ratio significantly higher than what the larger male candidates would face. When she had raised her hand to ask about the rationale for the increased load, Blackwood's response had been swift and cutting. "Ma'am, if you're having concerns about the physical requirements, perhaps you should reconsider whether this program is appropriate for your current capabilities." The other candidates had exchanged meaningful glances, recognizing the trap that Blackwood had set. Any objection Elena raised would be interpreted as evidence that she couldn't handle the demands of the program. Her only option was to accept the challenge and hope that her experience would compensate for the obvious disadvantage. The first exercise under the new standards had been a 12-hour simulation of a supply mission across frozen terrain. Elena had strapped the 90-pound pack to her shoulders, feeling the immediate strain on her back and legs. The weight was manageable, but maintaining it over extended distances would test her endurance in ways that the younger candidates wouldn't experience. Sergeant Rodriguez, one of the assistant instructors, had approached Elena during her gear preparation with what appeared to be helpful advice. "Ma'am, if you'd like, we can redistribute some of your equipment among the other candidates. Team cohesion is important, and we want everyone to succeed." Elena had recognized the offer as another test designed to see if she would accept special accommodation that could later be used to disqualify her. "Thank you, Sergeant, but I'll carry my assigned load. If the requirement is 90 pounds, that's what I'll carry." Rodriguez had shrugged, making a note on his clipboard that Elena was certain would not work in her favor. The instructors were building a case against her, documenting every interaction and decision to support their eventual recommendation that she be removed from the program. The mission itself had been deliberately punishing. The route included steep climbs over ice-covered ridges, descents through loose snow that could swallow a person to their waist, and long stretches across exposed terrain where the wind chill dropped the effective temperature to -60 degrees. Elena had maintained her steady pace, though the additional weight had forced her to work harder than during the previous week's exercises. By the 4th hour, several of the male candidates had begun to struggle with their loads, their movements becoming less coordinated as fatigue set in. Elena had noticed Lieutenant Morrison adjusting his pack straps repeatedly, trying to find a configuration that would relieve the pressure on his shoulders. Sergeant Jackson had developed a noticeable limp, though he was trying to hide it from the instructors. Elena had felt the strain in her own body, particularly in her lower back, where old injuries from her military service had left permanent weaknesses. But she had also felt the quiet satisfaction that came from performing competently under difficult conditions. Her decades of experience had taught her how to manage discomfort, how to pace herself for sustained effort, and how to maintain focus when everything in her body wanted to quit. The halfway checkpoint had revealed the true purpose of the exercise. Chief Blackwood had been waiting with a clipboard and a stopwatch, timing each candidate's arrival and making notes about their condition. When Elena had reached the checkpoint, he had looked genuinely surprised to see her maintaining her position in the middle of the group. "Captain Vasquez, how are you feeling?" he had asked, his tone suggesting that he expected her to request medical attention or assistance. "I'm feeling strong, Chief, ready to continue," Elena had replied, taking the opportunity to adjust her gear and check her navigation equipment. Blackwood had made a note on his clipboard, his expression revealing nothing about whether her performance was meeting his expectations. "The second half of the route is more challenging, Captain. The terrain gets more difficult, and we'll be moving through areas where a mistake could be fatal." Elena had understood that he was giving her an opportunity to withdraw without officially failing. "I appreciate the warning, Chief. I'll be careful." The second half of the mission had indeed been more challenging, but Elena had found herself drawing strength from the familiar environment. The Arctic landscape that intimidated most people felt like home to her, a place where her decades of experience provided advantages that couldn't be measured in physical tests or classroom evaluations. When the exercise had concluded, Elena had finished in the top third of the candidates, despite carrying proportionally more weight than any of her peers. Her time had been respectable, her navigation had been accurate, and her physical condition had remained strong throughout the 12-hour ordeal. By any objective measure, her performance had been successful. Chief Blackwood's debrief had focused almost exclusively on the candidates who had struggled, offering detailed criticism of their technique, preparation, and mental approach. When he had reached Elena's performance, his comments had been brief and neutral, acknowledging her completion of the exercise without offering praise or identifying areas for improvement. Captain Vasquez maintained an adequate pace and completed the route within acceptable parameters, he had stated, his tone suggesting that adequate was barely sufficient. Elena had understood that Blackwood was damning her with faint praise, establishing a narrative that her performance was marginal rather than competent. The strategy was subtle but effective, creating doubt about her capabilities without making accusations that could be challenged or disproven. The reaction of her fellow candidates had been mixed. Some seemed genuinely impressed that she had completed such a demanding exercise without difficulty, while others appeared to dismiss her performance as the result of favorable conditions or instructor accommodation. Lieutenant Morrison had approached her after the debrief with what seemed like grudging respect. "Ma'am, I have to say, I didn't think you'd be able to keep up with that load," he had admitted. "You've definitely earned some credibility today." Elena had appreciated his honesty, even though she had recognized that his surprise revealed the extent of his prejudice. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I hope my performance will speak for itself as the training continues." Morrison had nodded, though Elena had sensed that he was still skeptical about her long-term prospects in the program. His attitude represented the best-case scenario among her peers, grudging respect tempered by continued doubt about her ultimate suitability for special operations. The worst-case scenario had been represented by Sergeant Peters, one of the candidates who had struggled during the exercise. Rather than acknowledging Elena's superior performance, he had chosen to attribute it to factors beyond her control. "She probably got a lighter pack," Peters had muttered to a group of candidates who thought Elena was out of earshot. "Or they gave her an easier route. There's no way someone her age outperforms guys like us without some kind of help." Elena had chosen not to respond to Peters' accusations, understanding that defending herself would only reinforce his perception that she was receiving special treatment. The truth was that her pack had been weighed in front of all the candidates, and her route had been identical to everyone else's. Peters was simply unable to accept that his assumptions about age and capability had been proven wrong. The third week had brought the introduction of weapons training, an area where Elena had hoped her extensive military experience would provide obvious advantages. The curriculum had included marksmanship, weapons maintenance, and tactical shooting under extreme conditions. Elena had approached these lessons with quiet confidence, knowing that her skills in this area were far superior to what her official records suggested. Instructor Walsh, a former Marine sniper with multiple combat deployments, had begun the training with a lecture on the challenges of maintaining weapons in Arctic conditions. He had emphasized the importance of proper cleaning, lubrication, and storage techniques that would prevent mechanical failures when lives depended on weapon reliability. Elena had listened attentively, though most of the information had been familiar from her years of covert operations in similar environments. She had learned long ago that weapons required different maintenance procedures in extreme cold, and she had developed techniques that went beyond the standard military protocols. The first practical exercise had been basic marksmanship at various distances, designed to establish each candidate's baseline shooting ability. Elena had approached the firing line with careful attention to her stance, breathing, and trigger control, drawing on muscle memory that had been developed through thousands of hours of practice. Her first shots had grouped tightly in the center of the target, demonstrating accuracy that exceeded the performance of most other candidates. Instructor Walsh had observed her technique with growing interest, noting the professional competence of her movements and the consistency of her results. "Captain Vasquez, where did you develop your shooting skills?" Walsh had asked, his tone reflecting genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. Elena had been prepared for this question, knowing that her marksmanship would eventually reveal capabilities that exceeded her official background. "I spent a lot of time on ranges during my logistics assignments, instructor. I believe that every soldier should be proficient with their weapon." Walsh had accepted her explanation, though Elena had suspected that he recognized her skills as more advanced than casual range practice would produce. Her shooting demonstrated the kind of precision that came from extensive training and real-world application, not recreational target practice. The advanced shooting exercises had been more revealing. The candidates had been required to engage targets while moving across difficult terrain, simulate combat conditions with time pressure and physical stress, and demonstrate proficiency with multiple weapon systems under various environmental conditions. Elena had excelled in every scenario, her performance consistently ranking among the top candidates, despite her lack of recent formal training. Her movements had been economical and precise. Her target engagement had been fast and accurate, and her weapon handling had demonstrated familiarity that could only come from extensive experience. By the end of the week, Instructor Walsh had begun using Elena as an example for other candidates, highlighting her technique and decision-making as models to emulate. His praise had been professional and objective, based on measurable performance rather than accommodation or lowered standards. Captain Vasquez demonstrates excellent muzzle discipline and target acquisition, Walsh had announced during a group debrief. Her approach to shooting under stress should be studied by everyone in this program. The recognition had been gratifying, but Elena had also recognized that it created new challenges. Her obvious competence with weapons had undermined the narrative that her age made her unsuitable for special operations, forcing her critics to find other areas where they could question her capabilities. Chief Blackwood had been quick to identify those areas. During the 4th week, he had introduced close-quarters combat training, emphasizing hand-to-hand fighting techniques that favored youth, size, and raw physical strength over experience and tactical thinking. Arctic operations often involve confined spaces where firearms are ineffective, Blackwood had explained as he introduced the curriculum. Personnel must be capable of defending themselves and completing missions using only their physical capabilities. The training had begun with basic defensive techniques, moves designed to escape from holds and create distance from attackers. Elena had approached these lessons with the same methodical attention she brought to all aspects of her training, though she had recognized that this would be one of the most challenging areas for someone her age. Her first sparring partner had been Sergeant Williams, a powerfully built candidate who outweighed her by nearly 80 pounds. The pairing had been presented as random, but Elena had suspected that Blackwood had deliberately matched her against one of the strongest candidates to expose her physical limitations. Williams had been respectful but aggressive, testing Elena's ability to defend against someone with significant advantages in size and strength. She had relied on technique and experience to compensate for her disadvantages, using leverage and timing to neutralize his attacks rather than trying to match his physical power. The results had been mixed. Elena had demonstrated competent defensive skills and had managed to avoid being dominated by her larger opponent, but she had also been clearly at a disadvantage in terms of raw physical capability. Williams had been able to control the pace of their encounters, forcing Elena to react rather than initiate action. Blackwood had observed these sessions with obvious satisfaction, finally finding an area where Elena's age created measurable limitations. During the debrief, he had focused extensively on the importance of physical dominance in close-quarters combat, emphasizing scenarios where technical skill might not be sufficient to overcome determined opposition. In real-world operations, personnel may face opponents who are larger, stronger, and more aggressive than training partners, Blackwood had stated, his gaze lingering on Elena. Success requires the ability to physically impose your will on the enemy, not just survive their attacks. Elena had understood the message clearly. Blackwood was establishing a standard that would be difficult for her to meet, regardless of her other capabilities. She had faced similar challenges throughout her career, situations where her physical limitations had required creative solutions and exceptional performance in other areas. The 5th week had brought the introduction of team leadership exercises, scenarios where candidates would be evaluated on their ability to command others under stressful conditions. Elena had approached these challenges with particular interest, knowing that her decades of military experience had provided her with leadership skills that most of her younger peers had not yet developed. The first exercise had required each candidate to lead a squad through a complex navigation problem in deteriorating weather conditions. Elena had been assigned a team that included Lieutenant Morrison, Sergeant Peters, and 2 other candidates who had been among her most vocal critics. The mission had required the team to locate and retrieve a simulated casualty from a position several miles away, using only map and compass navigation, while dealing with visibility reduced to less than 50 yards by blowing snow. Elena had approached the challenge with the systematic planning that had characterized her entire career. Her first decision had been to establish clear communication protocols, ensuring that every team member understood their role and responsibilities. She had assigned navigation responsibilities to Morrison, whose land navigation skills had been consistently strong, while keeping oversight of the overall route planning. "Lieutenant Morrison, I want you to handle pace counting and bearing checks," Elena had instructed. "Sergeant Peters, you'll monitor our timeline and weather conditions. Everyone else maintains security and helps with obstacle navigation." The team had initially been skeptical of Elena's leadership, their body language suggesting that they were prepared to challenge her decisions if they disagreed with her approach. But as the exercise had progressed, her competence had become increasingly obvious. Elena's navigation had been precise and efficient, avoiding the kind of errors that had plagued other teams during similar exercises. Her decision-making had been quick and confident, based on years of experience in reading terrain and weather conditions. Most importantly, she had maintained team cohesion under conditions that had caused other groups to fragment and fail. When they had reached the casualty location, Elena had organized the team for medical treatment and extraction with the kind of tactical awareness that demonstrated deep understanding of real-world operations. Her instructions had been clear and purposeful, leaving no doubt about what each team member needed to accomplish. The return journey had been more challenging, as the weather conditions had continued to deteriorate and the additional burden of the casualty had slowed their movement. Elena had adjusted their route to account for the changed conditions, making decisions that prioritized safety while still meeting the mission timeline. Lieutenant Morrison had been the first to acknowledge Elena's leadership capabilities. Halfway through the exercise, he had approached her during a brief rest stop with an expression of genuine respect. "Ma'am, I have to admit, this is some of the best leadership I've experienced during the training," he had said quietly. "You're making decisions that I wouldn't have thought of, and you're keeping us together when other teams are falling apart." Elena had appreciated Morrison's honesty, recognizing that his acknowledgement represented a significant shift in his attitude toward her capabilities. "Thank you, Lieutenant. Leadership isn't about age or physical strength. It's about making good decisions under pressure and taking care of your people." The exercise had concluded with Elena's team completing the mission faster than any other group, despite the challenging conditions and the initial skepticism of her team members. Their success had been based on superior planning, efficient execution, and Elena's ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Chief Blackwood's debrief had focused heavily on Elena's performance, though his comments had been grudgingly positive rather than enthusiastic. Captain Vasquez demonstrated competent tactical leadership and maintained team cohesion under difficult conditions, he had stated, his tone suggesting that competent was barely adequate. Elena had recognized Blackwood's continued effort to minimize her achievements, but she had also understood that her leadership performance had been impossible to dismiss or discredit. Even candidates who had been skeptical of her presence had been forced to acknowledge her effectiveness as a leader. The team leadership exercises had continued throughout the week, with Elena consistently performing among the top candidates. Her approach had been characterized by thorough planning, clear communication, and the kind of tactical awareness that could only come from extensive real-world experience. By the end of the 5th week, Elena had established herself as one of the most competent leaders in the program. Despite the continued skepticism of some instructors and candidates, her performance had been based on objective measures of success, rather than subjective evaluations, making it difficult for her critics to maintain their arguments about her unsuitability for special operations. The 6th week had brought the introduction of survival training, scenarios designed to test each candidate's ability to remain alive and functional in extreme Arctic conditions with minimal equipment. Elena had approached these challenges with particular confidence, knowing that her background had included extensive survival training that went far beyond standard military protocols. The first exercise had required candidates to construct emergency shelters using only materials they could find in the immediate environment. Elena had been assigned a location with limited natural resources, forcing her to rely on creativity and experience rather than abundant supplies. Her shelter construction had demonstrated techniques that impressed even the instructors. Elena had created a structure that provided effective insulation and wind protection while requiring minimal energy to maintain. Her approach had been based on principles she had learned during covert operations, where survival often depended on improvisation and resourcefulness. Instructor Davis, a survival specialist with extensive Arctic experience, had examined Elena's shelter with obvious interest. "Captain Vasquez, this is excellent work. Where did you learn these construction techniques?" Elena had been prepared for such questions, knowing that her survival skills exceeded what her official background would suggest. "I spent a lot of time in the Alaska wilderness during my off-duty hours, instructor. I wanted to be prepared for emergency situations." Davis had accepted her explanation, though Elena had suspected that he recognized her techniques as more advanced than recreational camping would typically provide. Her shelter demonstrated the kind of expertise that came from formal training and real-world application under life-threatening conditions. The survival exercises had continued with fire-making, food procurement, and water purification challenges that tested each candidate's ability to maintain themselves in hostile conditions. Elena had excelled in every area, her performance consistently ranking among the best in the program. Her fire-making had been particularly impressive, as she had succeeded in creating sustainable flames under conditions that had defeated most other candidates. Elena had used techniques that conserved fuel while providing maximum heat output, demonstrating knowledge that went beyond basic survival training. The food procurement exercise had required candidates to identify and prepare edible plants and animals that could sustain them during extended operations. Elena's performance had been exceptional, as she had identified resources that other candidates had overlooked and had prepared them using methods that maximized nutritional value while minimizing health risks. Instructor Davis had begun using Elena as an example for other candidates, highlighting her techniques and decision-making as models to emulate. His praise had been based on measurable competence rather than accommodation, making it difficult for her critics to dismiss her achievements. "Captain Vasquez demonstrates survival skills that exceed program standards," Davis had announced during a group debrief. "Her approach to resource management and shelter construction should be studied by everyone here." The recognition had been professionally satisfying, but Elena had also understood that her obvious competence in survival training had created new challenges with instructors who were determined to find areas where her age created limitations. The 7th week had brought the most challenging phase of the training program: extended field exercises that would test all aspects of each candidate's capabilities under conditions that closely simulated real-world operations. Elena had approached these challenges with quiet confidence, knowing that her decades of experience had prepared her for exactly this type of comprehensive evaluation. The first extended exercise had required teams to conduct a simulated reconnaissance mission over a 3-day period, operating in temperatures that dropped below -40 degrees while maintaining constant movement and communication with base operations. Elena had been assigned to lead a team that included some of her most vocal critics, creating additional pressure to perform at exceptional levels. Her planning had been meticulous, incorporating lessons learned from decades of similar operations while adapting to the specific requirements of the current mission. Elena had developed contingency plans for weather deterioration, equipment failure, and casualty evacuation, demonstrating the kind of comprehensive thinking that separated experienced operators from novice soldiers. The execution had been flawless. Elena's team had completed their reconnaissance objectives ahead of schedule while maintaining perfect operational security, and communication protocols. Her leadership had been characterized by calm decision-making under pressure and the ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions. Sergeant Peters, who had been among Elena's harshest critics, had approached her at the conclusion of the exercise with an expression that mixed surprise and respect. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. I thought your age would make you a liability. But you've been one of the strongest performers in the program." Elena had appreciated Peter's honesty, recognizing that his acknowledgement represented a significant shift in attitude among the candidates who had initially been skeptical of her presence. "Thank you, Sergeant. I hope this demonstrates that experience can be just as valuable as youth in the right circumstances." The extended field exercises had continued throughout the week, with Elena consistently performing among the top candidates in every scenario. Her competence had been demonstrated through objective measures of success rather than subjective evaluations, making it increasingly difficult for her critics to maintain their arguments about her unsuitability for special operations. By the end of the 7th week, Elena had established herself as one of the most competent candidates in the program, despite the continued resistance of Chief Blackwood and a few other instructors who remained committed to the belief that age was inherently disqualifying for special operations assignments. The 8th week had brought the final series of evaluations that would determine which candidates would be selected for Arctic Special Operations. Elena had approached these challenges with the same methodical preparation that had characterized her entire military career, knowing that everything she had worked toward would be decided in the coming days. The final evaluations had included comprehensive testing in all areas covered during the training program, from physical fitness and weapons proficiency to leadership capabilities and survival skills. Elena had performed consistently well in every category, her scores ranking among the top candidates despite the obvious efforts of some instructors to find reasons to disqualify her. Chief Blackwood had maintained his skeptical attitude throughout the final week, continuing to question Elena's long-term viability as a special operations soldier, despite her demonstrated competence in every area of evaluation. His resistance had become increasingly obvious to other candidates and instructors, creating tension within the training cadre about the fairness of the selection process. The culmination of 8 weeks of training had been building toward a final challenge that would separate those who earned selection from those who would be returned to their previous assignments. Elena had prepared for this moment throughout her military career, though she had never imagined that the opportunity would come at the age of 52. The announcement of the final challenge had come during the morning briefing on the last Friday of the training program. Chief Blackwood had stood before the remaining candidates with the kind of expression that suggested he was about to deliver news that would fundamentally change their lives. "The final evaluation will be conducted as a solo survival exercise," Blackwood had announced, his gaze settling on Elena with obvious intent. "Each candidate will be transported to a remote location in the Arctic wilderness and will be required to survive for 7 days with minimal equipment." Elena had felt a surge of anticipation mixed with apprehension. Solo survival in Arctic conditions was among the most challenging tests that could be administered to special operations candidates, requiring not just physical capability but mental toughness, technical expertise, and the kind of resourcefulness that could only be developed through extensive experience. "The exercise will test every aspect of your training," Blackwood had continued. "Candidates will be evaluated on their ability to maintain themselves in extreme conditions, navigate to designated checkpoints, and complete assigned missions while operating alone and without support." The parameters of the challenge had been deliberately harsh. Each candidate would be provided with basic cold weather clothing, a limited amount of food and water, basic navigation equipment, and a communication device for emergencies only. They would be required to survive 8 days and 7 nights in conditions that regularly dropped below -30 degrees, with the possibility of severe weather that could make movement dangerous or impossible. Elena had listened to the briefing with the kind of focused attention that had characterized her approach to every aspect of the training program. She had understood that this final challenge would be her ultimate opportunity to demonstrate that age was not a limiting factor for someone with her background and capabilities. The location assignments had been distributed that afternoon, with each candidate receiving coordinates for their individual starting points and a list of objectives they would be required to complete during the exercise. Elena had studied her assignment carefully, noting that her location appeared to be among the most challenging in terms of terrain and distance from potential shelter or resources. She had spent the evening before deployment reviewing her equipment and mentally rehearsing the techniques she would need to survive the coming week. Elena had drawn on memories of similar situations from her covert operations background, recalling lessons learned from missions that had required her to operate alone in hostile environments for extended periods. The helicopter flight to her starting location had been Elena's final opportunity to assess the terrain and weather conditions she would face during the exercise. The landscape below had been stark and forbidding, an endless expanse of snow and ice broken only by occasional rock formations and frozen streams. The pilot had set her down in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, the rotor wash creating a brief whirlwind of snow before the aircraft disappeared into the gray sky. Elena had stood alone in the sudden silence, feeling the weight of the challenge ahead while also experiencing the familiar comfort that came from being in her natural element. The first priority had been establishing shelter, creating a base of operations that would protect her from the elements while providing a secure location for planning and equipment maintenance. Elena had selected a site that offered natural wind protection while maintaining access to firewood and water sources. Her shelter construction had drawn on techniques she had learned during decades of survival training, creating a structure that would maintain warmth while requiring minimal energy to sustain. Elena had worked efficiently in the fading daylight, knowing that darkness would bring temperatures that could be fatal without adequate protection. The first night had been a test of both her preparation and her mental toughness. Temperatures had dropped to -35 degrees, with wind gusts that had made the effective temperature even lower. Elena had maintained her shelter fire throughout the night, using techniques that balanced fuel conservation with heat production. She had awakened the next morning feeling strong and confident, ready to begin the navigation and mission completion phases of the exercise. Elena had studied her map carefully, planning routes that would allow her to reach assigned checkpoints while conserving energy and minimizing exposure to dangerous conditions. The second day had brought the first of several mission objectives, requiring Elena to navigate to a specific location and retrieve a cached item that would be necessary for subsequent tasks. The route had involved crossing difficult terrain in deteriorating weather conditions, testing her ability to maintain course accuracy under challenging circumstances. Elena's navigation had been precise and efficient, reaching the objective ahead of schedule despite the difficult conditions. Her movement techniques had been based on decades of experience in similar environments, allowing her to maintain speed while conserving energy for the challenges ahead. The retrieved item had been a piece of specialized equipment that would be required for a subsequent mission, demonstrating the integrated nature of the exercise and the importance of completing each objective successfully. Elena had incorporated the new equipment into her load while adjusting her plans for the remaining days of the exercise. The third day had brought severe weather that had forced Elena to remain in her shelter for extended periods, testing her ability to maintain morale and physical condition during forced inactivity. She had used the time productively, maintaining her equipment and reviewing her plans for the objectives that remained to be completed. The storm had provided an opportunity to demonstrate one of the most important survival skills, the ability to remain calm and focused during periods of stress and uncertainty. Elena had drawn on meditation techniques she had learned during her military training, maintaining mental clarity while conserving physical energy for the challenges ahead. The fourth day had brought clearing weather and the most challenging navigation objective of the exercise, requiring Elena to reach a checkpoint located in terrain that would test her technical climbing and route-finding abilities. She had approached the challenge with the systematic planning that had characterized her entire military career. The route had required Elena to cross several frozen streams, navigate through dense forest, and climb ice-covered rock formations that would have challenged experienced mountaineers. Her progress had been steady and methodical, drawing on technical skills that went beyond standard military training. Elena had reached the checkpoint ahead of schedule, demonstrating navigation accuracy and technical competence that exceeded the performance of most candidates during similar exercises. Her confidence had grown with each successful objective, reinforcing her belief that experience was just as valuable as youth in extreme conditions. The fifth day had brought the most psychologically challenging aspect of the exercise, as Elena had been required to operate alone for an extended period without human contact or external validation of her decisions. She had maintained her mental focus through techniques she had learned during covert operations, when isolation and uncertainty were constant factors. The mission objectives for the day had included food procurement and water purification challenges that tested Elena's ability to sustain herself using only resources available in the immediate environment. Her performance had been exceptional, demonstrating survival skills that exceeded program standards. Elena had successfully identified and prepared several sources of nutrition while maintaining her energy levels and physical condition. Her techniques had been based on knowledge acquired during decades of survival training, adapted to the specific conditions and resources available in her current environment. The sixth day had brought the most physically demanding challenge of the exercise, requiring Elena to transport a heavy load across difficult terrain while maintaining her navigation accuracy and mission timeline. She had approached the challenge with the steady determination that had characterized her entire military career. The load had been designed to simulate the weight and bulk of equipment that might be required during real-world operations, testing each candidate's ability to maintain performance under conditions that closely approximated actual mission requirements. Elena had adjusted her movement techniques to accommodate the additional burden while maintaining her efficiency in navigation precision. Her performance during the load-carrying exercise had been among the strongest of her entire survival period, demonstrating that her physical conditioning and technical expertise remained effective even under the most demanding conditions. Elena had completed the day's objectives ahead of schedule while maintaining her energy reserves for the final challenges. The seventh day had brought the culminating test of the entire exercise, requiring Elena to demonstrate all of the skills she had developed during the previous week, while completing a complex mission that integrated every aspect of Arctic survival and operations. She had approached the challenge with quiet confidence, knowing that her performance would determine her final evaluation. The mission had required Elena to navigate to a specific location, conduct a detailed reconnaissance of the area, and return to her base camp with information that would be evaluated for accuracy and completeness. The challenge had tested not just her survival abilities, but her capability to complete operational missions under extreme conditions. Elena's reconnaissance had been thorough and professional, demonstrating the kind of attention to detail that characterized experienced intelligence personnel. Her observations had been accurate and comprehensive, providing information that exceeded the minimum requirements of the exercise. The return journey to her base camp had been Elena's final opportunity to demonstrate her capabilities during the solo survival exercise. She had maintained her navigation accuracy and movement efficiency, despite fatigue from 6 days of intensive operations, showing that her physical and mental conditioning remained strong throughout the extended challenge. The seventh night had been Elena's last opportunity to demonstrate her shelter and survival skills before the extraction scheduled for the following morning. She had maintained her camp with the same attention to detail that had characterized her entire performance, ensuring that her equipment remained functional and her physical condition remained strong. The morning of the 8th day had brought the sound of helicopter rotors, signaling the end of Elena's solo survival exercise and the beginning of her evaluation process. She had packed her equipment efficiently and prepared for extraction with the same methodical approach that had characterized her entire performance. As the helicopter had lifted off from her camp location, Elena had looked down at the terrain that had been her home for the previous week. The landscape that would have appeared hostile and forbidding to most people had provided her with everything she needed to survive and thrive, confirming her belief that experience and preparation were more important than youth and physical strength. The flight back to the training facility had been Elena's first opportunity to reflect on her performance during the solo survival exercise. She had completed every assigned mission, maintained her physical condition throughout the week-long challenge, and demonstrated survival skills that exceeded program standards in every measurable category. The debriefing process had been scheduled to begin immediately upon her return, with Chief Blackwood and the other instructors conducting detailed interviews about every aspect of her performance during the exercise. Elena had approached these sessions with confidence, knowing that her achievements spoke for themselves regardless of any remaining skepticism about her age or suitability for special operations. Elena stepped off the helicopter onto the familiar tarmac of the training facility, her boots crunching against frost-covered concrete. 8 days alone in the Arctic wilderness had left her leaner but stronger, her eyes carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had faced nature's worst and emerged victorious. The other candidates were already assembled in the briefing room, their faces showing varying degrees of exhaustion and relief from their own survival ordeals. Chief Blackwood stood at the front of the room with his characteristic stern expression, though Elena detected something different in his demeanor. Gone was the dismissive arrogance he had displayed throughout the training program, replaced by what appeared to be genuine curiosity about her performance during the solo exercise. Candidates, you have all completed the most challenging phase of Arctic Special Operations Selection, Blackwood announced, his voice carrying across the silent room. Your individual performances during the 8-day survival exercise will determine your final evaluation and selection for the program. Elena took her assigned seat among the other survivors, noting that several candidates had not returned from the exercise. She learned later that 3 had been extracted early due to equipment failures, 2 had suffered injuries that required medical evacuation, and 1 had voluntarily withdrawn after the 4th day when severe weather had tested his psychological resilience beyond his breaking point. Lieutenant Morrison, who sat 2 rows ahead of Elena, turned to offer her a nod of acknowledgement that carried far more respect than their early interactions had suggested. Sergeant Peters, once among her harshest critics, caught her eye and offered what appeared to be a genuine smile of congratulation for surviving the challenge. The debriefing process began with each candidate providing a detailed account of their survival experience, describing their strategies, challenges, and decision-making throughout the 8-day exercise. Elena listened carefully to the other presentations, noting the variety of approaches and outcomes that had characterized different candidates' experiences. When Blackwood called her name, Elena stood and moved to the front of the room with the same calm composure that had carried her through 8 weeks of training. She had prepared for this moment throughout her survival exercise, organizing her thoughts and observations into a coherent narrative that would demonstrate her competence without revealing the full extent of her classified background. Chief Blackwood, fellow candidates, Elena began, her voice steady and clear despite the fatigue that lingered from her ordeal. My survival strategy was based on conservative resource management, aggressive shelter preparation, and methodical mission completion. She proceeded to describe her approach to each day of the exercise, explaining her decision-making process and the techniques she had employed to overcome specific challenges. Elena's presentation was professional and detailed, demonstrating not just her survival capabilities, but her ability to analyze and learn from complex operational experiences. The room remained completely silent as Elena described her construction of multiple emergency shelters, her successful navigation through whiteout conditions, and her completion of reconnaissance missions that had required technical climbing and advanced survival skills. Her matter-of-fact delivery made extraordinary achievements sound routine, reflecting the depth of her experience and confidence. When she described her food procurement activities, including the successful hunting and preparation of small game, several candidates exchanged glances of obvious surprise. Elena's techniques had gone far beyond the basic survival training provided in the program, demonstrating knowledge that could only have come from extensive real-world application. Chief Blackwood interrupted her presentation with the question that everyone in the room had been anticipating. "Captain Vasquez, your survival skills appear to exceed standard military training. Where exactly did you acquire this level of expertise?" Elena paused for a moment, meeting Blackwood's gaze with the steady confidence that had characterized her entire military career. She reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a small leather folder that none of the other candidates had seen before, placing it on the table in front of the chief instructor. "Sir, I believe my complete service record will provide the context you're seeking," Elena said quietly. Blackwood opened the folder and began reading, his expression changing from skepticism to surprise to something approaching awe as he reviewed documents that had been classified far above the security level of the training program. The room watched in silence as he studied pages that revealed the true scope of Elena's military background. According to this record, Captain Vasquez served as a Special Operations Support Specialist for Northern Command, with deployments to classified locations throughout the Arctic region. Blackwood read aloud, his voice carrying a new tone of respect. She was the primary logistical coordinator for Operation Frozen, Shield, and 17 other classified missions in extreme weather environments. Elena remained standing calmly as Blackwood continued reading from her record, revealing commendations for valor, technical expertise awards, and survival training certifications that exceeded the qualifications of most instructors in the program. The folder contained 34 years of achievements that had been deliberately obscured to protect operational security. "It says here that you were recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross after maintaining supply lines for a special operations team that was cut off behind enemy lines for 6 weeks during winter conditions." Blackwood continued, his skepticism completely replaced by professional respect. "You kept 12 soldiers alive in -40-degree weather using improvised techniques and captured equipment." The revelation transformed the atmosphere in the briefing room completely. Candidates who had questioned Elena's presence throughout the training program now understood that they had been learning alongside someone whose experience far exceeded their own. The woman they had seen as an aging interloper was actually one of the most qualified Arctic operations specialists in military history. Sergeant Peters raised his hand tentatively, his earlier hostility replaced by genuine curiosity. "Ma'am, if you had this background, why didn't you mention it when people were questioning your qualifications?" Elena smiled slightly, recognizing the question as an opportunity to address the broader issues that had motivated her return to active duty. "Sergeant, I wanted to be evaluated on my current capabilities, not my past achievements. More importantly, I needed to know whether this program was selecting the best candidates or just the ones who fit traditional expectations." Chief Blackwood closed the folder and looked directly at Elena, his expression showing a combination of embarrassment and newfound respect. "Captain Vasquez, I owe you an apology. I allowed my assumptions about age to cloud my judgment about your qualifications." Your performance throughout this program has been exceptional by any measure." Elena nodded graciously, understanding that Blackwood's acknowledgement represented more than personal vindication. "Thank you, Chief. I hope this experience will help the program evaluate all candidates based on their capabilities rather than their demographics." The formal selection results were announced the following morning during a ceremony attended by senior officers from Northern Command. Elena's name was called first among the successful candidates, with commendations for outstanding performance. In every category of evaluation, the recognition was professionally satisfying, but more importantly, it represented validation of her belief that experience and wisdom were just as valuable as youth and physical strength. Colonel Richards, the commanding officer of Arctic Special Operations, approached Elena after the ceremony with an offer that she had not anticipated. "Captain Vasquez, based on your performance and background, we'd like to offer you the position of Chief Instructor for Arctic Survival Training. You would be responsible for developing curriculum and training the next generation of Special Operations personnel." Elena considered the offer carefully, recognizing both its honor and its implications. Accepting the position would provide her with the authority to prevent future tragedies like Operation Frozen Shield, ensuring that soldiers received the training they needed to survive in extreme conditions. It would also allow her to address the institutional biases that had nearly prevented her own selection. "Sir, I'm honored by the offer, but I'd like to serve as a regular team member first," Elena replied. "I think it's important to demonstrate that age doesn't prevent someone from performing operational duties before taking on training responsibilities." Colonel Richards smiled, recognizing Elena's wisdom in wanting to prove herself in the field before assuming a leadership role. "Understood, Captain. You'll be assigned to Team Alpha for their upcoming mission, and will revisit the instructor position after you've had operational experience with the unit." Elena's first operational mission came 6 weeks later when Team Alpha was deployed to establish a forward observation post in a region where intelligence suggested hostile activity. The mission required the team to operate in extreme conditions for 3 weeks, maintaining surveillance while remaining undetected by potential enemies. Elena's performance during the mission exceeded even the high expectations that had been established by her training success. Her survival skills kept the team comfortable and healthy despite conditions that challenged their equipment and endurance. Her tactical expertise contributed to mission planning that avoided several potential compromises. Most importantly, her calm leadership during a crisis situation prevented what could have been a catastrophic equipment failure. The mission's success led to Elena's rapid integration into the special operations community, where her age was no longer seen as a limitation, but as an asset that brought valuable perspective and experience. Younger operators sought her mentorship, recognizing that her knowledge could improve their own chances of survival and success. Within a year, Elena had accepted the chief instructor position, but on her own terms. She established new training protocols that emphasized competence over demographics, ensuring that all candidates would be evaluated fairly regardless of age, gender, or background. Her curriculum became the standard for Arctic Special Operations training throughout the military. Elena also established a mentorship program that paired experienced operators with newer personnel, creating knowledge transfer that improved the entire special operations community. The program was particularly effective at addressing the biases and assumptions that had nearly prevented her own success. The broader impact of Elena's achievements extended far beyond her individual career. Her success opened doors for older personnel who had been automatically excluded from special operations assignments, leading to policy changes that emphasized capability over arbitrary age limits. The military recognized that experience and wisdom were valuable resources that should not be wasted. 5 years after her selection, Elena was promoted to major and assigned as the Director of Advanced Arctic Training for the entire Department of Defense. Her responsibilities included developing doctrine and training standards for all military services operating in extreme cold weather environments. The position allowed Elena to ensure that future soldiers would receive the training and equipment they needed to survive conditions like those that had claimed the lives of her colleagues during Operation Frozen Shield. Her work prevented countless tragedies by establishing standards based on real-world experience rather than theoretical models. Elena's legacy extended beyond her own achievements to the soldiers she trained and the leaders she mentored. The officers who learned from her carried forward her emphasis on competence over prejudice, creating a more effective and inclusive special operations community that valued capability regardless of demographics. The military awards and recognition that Elena received throughout her later career were professionally satisfying, but her greatest pride came from the knowledge that her persistence had created opportunities for others who might otherwise have been excluded from service. She had proven that barriers based on age or other demographic factors were artificial limitations that weakened rather than strengthened military effectiveness. 10 years after her Arctic Special Operations selection, Elena retired from active duty with the rank of lieutenant colonel, having established herself as one of the most respected survival and training experts in military history. Her techniques were taught throughout the special operations community, and her leadership principles were studied in military academies. Elena returned to Alaska, where she established a civilian training company that provided survival instruction to military personnel, law enforcement officers, and civilian adventurers. Her courses became the gold standard for Arctic survival training, attracting students from around the world who wanted to learn from someone with unparalleled experience. The quiet apartment in Anchorage, where Elena had once hidden her capabilities, became a gathering place for former students and colleagues who continued to seek her advice and mentorship. The locked cabinet that had once concealed her military decorations now displayed them proudly, symbols of a career spent pushing beyond artificial limitations. Elena's story became a case study in military leadership schools, demonstrating the importance of evaluating personnel based on capability rather than preconceptions. Her experience showed that diversity of background and experience strengthened units rather than weakening them, providing perspectives and skills that homogeneous groups might lack. The personal satisfaction that Elena derived from her achievements was matched by the knowledge that she had honored the memory of colleagues who had died due to inadequate training and preparation. Her work ensured that future soldiers would be better equipped to survive the challenges they would face in extreme environments. Elena continued to receive recognition throughout her retirement, including induction into the Special Operations Hall of Fame and honorary degrees from several universities that studied her contributions to military training and leadership. She used these platforms to advocate for inclusive policies that would prevent talented individuals from being excluded based on demographic factors. The woman who had once been dismissed as too old for special operations had become a symbol of the importance of persistence, competence, and the courage to challenge institutional biases. Elena's legacy demonstrated that true strength was measured not by conforming to others' expectations, but by excelling despite their limitations. Her story continued to inspire soldiers and civilians who faced their own challenges with discrimination and low expectations. Elena's example showed that age, gender, and other demographic factors were far less important than determination, preparation, and the willingness to prove oneself through performance rather than words. The Arctic wilderness that had tested Elena throughout her career remained a source of strength and reflection throughout her retirement. She continued to spend time in the environment that had shaped her character and proven her capabilities, finding peace in the landscapes that others considered hostile and forbidding. Elena's influence extended beyond the military to civilian organizations that recognized the value of her leadership principles and training methods. Her emphasis on competence over demographics became a model for other institutions seeking to maximize their effectiveness while promoting fairness and inclusion. The medals and commendations that Elena had once hidden became symbols of possibility for others who faced similar challenges. Her story demonstrated that barriers could be overcome through persistence, preparation, and the courage to stand alone when necessary to prove what was possible. Elena Vasquez had transformed from an underestimated logistics officer into one of the most respected special operations professionals in military history. Her journey proved that true capability knew no age limit, and that experience and wisdom were resources too valuable to waste based on arbitrary limitations. Her legacy continued to open doors and create opportunities for those who followed, ensuring that competence would always triumph over prejudice. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.